Hey everyone, it's Argonath here from The Right Way, and in this video we're going to look at a very interesting and also worrying article about what the New Zealand government is trying to push through. So generally New Zealand is a democracy built on capitalism with social services to take care of the people that aren't too well off. So it's not a fully capitalist system, it's not completely free market. There are government regulations, obviously, you need some to have some control of the market, and there's a huge social service component of the government as well. But in this article which I came across, which is very worrying, the government is now slipping in some legislation that will become law if it's not stopped, to bring in some socialist legislation for them to take over private companies. So let's have a look at what the definition of socialism is, just in case you don't know. So socialism is an economic and political system where workers own the general means of production, farms, factories, tools, raw materials. This can be achieved through decentralized and direct worker ownership or centralized state ownership of the means of production. So the government owns the company and they control the means of production, and obviously the government is for the workers, but that doesn't always happen in a socialist country, right? This is different from capitalism, where the means of production are privately owned by capital holders and people work for a reasonable wage for those particular workers. Alright, and if we look at some of the other definitions through Google, they all kind of mean the same thing. Socialism, a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole, or the state acts as the community. Cool, and then there's another one which kind of means exactly the same thing. So I think we can agree that if the government owns the means of production, then it's going to be a socialist thing, right? So let's have a look at what's happening in New Zealand. So this article is from a blog called Great Society from Matt Burgess. So if you want, you can Google Great Society or Google Matt Burgess, and I'm sure you'll come across his blog. Really well worth reading if you are a right-leaning person. And even if you're a left-leaning person, it's actually really well worth reading because there are some very interesting points made, which are backed up by evidence as well. So you can learn a lot out of it and maybe open your eyes a little bit. So what's happening in New Zealand regarding the socialist legislation that's coming through? So having banned saliva testing for more than a year, the government is now proposing to take it, as in expropriate investors and manufacturers of COVID testing products. So we've been running COVID nasal swabs to do our testing since the beginning of the COVID epidemic, and when we had that particular testing thing. Now that takes a lot of time. It takes experienced people with the correct expertise to administer those tests, and so it's quite slow. So one of the rapid testing things is to use saliva testing, which anyone can do themselves, and then it can be tested in a lab, or eventually, once everything has been researched and stuff, you could actually do the testing at home. So the problem is that the New Zealand government has been very slow to react on this. They put out misinformation about saliva testing, and eventually they went with a company that wasn't accredited when they gave them the contract, but they ignored a company called Reiko, which is a New Zealand company, which had an accredited saliva testing regime. It was used by the New Zealand Olympic Committee to get their athletes to the Tokyo Olympic Games. So if it should be good enough for the Tokyo Olympic Games, it must be good enough for the government, surely. But they didn't give it to them. Now, apparently what had happened is that the company that got the contract, that country was bought out half by the New Zealand Superannuation Fund and the Canadian Pension Fund. And so basically the government has a stake in that particular company. There's a bit of cronyism going on there, I think. So I covered all of this in a previous video. I've put a link to the video in the description of this video. Just click on the show more button and in the description. It should pop up with the link. Otherwise, if you look through my playlist, you should see something about poor saliva testing rollout in New Zealand, and that will give you all the background about what's going on. So basically, there is other legislation where the government can come in and expropriate or requisition private property. So things like if the government needs to build a new highway, you need to buy houses or buildings so that the road can go through there. You can, the government can buy that particular property through the Public Works Act, but that has more protections, like a process to determine the market rate. So this is an independent process that the government must pay. Right, the government can't negotiate out of it. Whatever is decided, which is a fair and equitable amount, must be given. They can, so with the new thing, they can just insist we give up our stock and our reagents and our premises that we need to do our work. So this is from Leon Grice, who's the CEO of Rako Science, who developed the saliva testing regime in New Zealand. So Matt writes, this is real. The government really is proposing to give the Minister of Health the right to insist we give up our stock and our reagents and our premises that we need to do our work. And there's a link to the Public Health Response Amendment Bill, which is the thing that the government is rushing through under urgency. So they're not having a full and proper discussion about this. So one of the things is over here. So this one which is highlighted is the important thing that we're talking about. Deliver or use, in accordance with directions given under the order, specified quantities of COVID-19 testing consumables that the Minister considers necessary for the purposes of the public health response to COVID-19. So they didn't give Rako Science the contract when they could have, because they were accredited, and then they went for an unaccredited company who still doesn't have an accredited saliva testing regime out yet, after so many months and months, which is just ridiculous. So Matt Burgess writes, the bill says the Minister will be able to set quality control standards in labs, manage the supply of testing consumables, and set different rules for different classes of testing. Presumably the government's target is Rako, because Rako is the only other company in New Zealand who is currently doing for private businesses saliva testing for COVID-19, and it's working really well. So the government pretty much looks like they just want to take that because they don't want to give them the money. They must have something against Rako Science for some reason. A compensation or payment relating to requisitions. So the owner of a testing laboratory injuriously affected by the requisitioning of testing consumables is entitled to receive compensation from the Crown at the market rate for the consumables requisition. The owner of a testing laboratory required to undertake COVID-19 testing solely for the purposes of the public health response to COVID-19 is entitled to be paid by the Crown for its services at the market rate for those services. All questions and disputes relating to claims for compensation or payment under the section must be heard and determined by the District Court, whose decision is final. However, the bill does not define what market rate is or say who decides it. So if the answer is the Ministry of Health officials, the purchaser of who wants to take over the private medical lab, then obviously there's a conflict of interest. There is a problem, right, as Matt Burgess states. So as I understand it, Grice has been asking for a commercial negotiation for the best part of a year. How is expropriation even on the table? The government can just or negotiate a contract with these people, right? Why are they looking to expropriate private companies, which is essentially a socialist thing to do, right? To take over the means of production from a private company. That company has spent probably millions or billions of dollars on research getting to where they are, and the government could just take it whatever value they want, right? It does say you'll be able to do a dispute in the district court, but how many years is that going to take to go through, right? It's just, this shouldn't be happening in a democracy like New Zealand. This shouldn't be being pushed through. If the government wants the company's thing, then they should negotiate for the company to provide saliva testing as a contract. Expropriation is likely even if the quota provisions are never used. So even if they don't use it, they can still expropriate the company for the bit that they want, even if they don't actually use it in the end, which seems really ludicrous. The government will have a commanding position in any commercial negotiation when in its back pocket it has the option to take the property of the counterparty and decide compensation. So basically, if the government were to negotiate with a company like Rayco, the government can say, well, if you don't take this offer, we might just take what we want and just give you what we decide. So you better, take this contract and just for what we're offering you. Otherwise, you might get even less than what we're offering you later on. It is breathtaking that a government which is borrowing $1 billion a week wants to nickel and dime the developer of the one thing we need more almost than anything else right now: a fast saliva-based PCR test for COVID. And it does work because they've been using it for quite a while now. If Grice's technology means 10 fewer minutes of lockdown, then pay him, right? Because 10 minutes of lockdown will cost more than whatever the government has to pay Rayco Science for their saliva testing. Let him have his millions, who cares? They'll probably just invest it in other things related to COVID. Or make a deal with a competitor, but there is no competitor because there's no one else that's accredited. Either way, it's worth it, and it's not just for COVID-19. We want Leon Grices of the world to turn up in the next pandemic too, right? So this is the thing. It's not just for this, it's for anything else that might come along as well. But no, this government is threatening to take the property of the one company which could do more than any other to get us out of lockdowns. I look forward to the government's explanation for how this is in the public interest. The judgment seemed astoundingly poor. This looks like world-class bad faith from officials and ministers. Another worrying aspect of the bill are the proposed changes for Section 12. The government wants to remove the prohibition which says a COVID-19 order may not apply only to a specific individual. Changes in Section 12 elsewhere in the bill are clearly designed to enable the Minister and Director General to issue health orders to specific individuals. So basically, at the moment, whatever they say has to apply to everyone in that particular field. They want to change it so that, no, we can apply it just to this particular company, but not to any of the other companies that we actually like. Right? This is draconian legislation, yet it seems to be slipping under the radar. It deserves attention. And Matt Burgess has a whole bunch of links in this particular article. So go to his article if you want to go to these particular links to do that. He follows up with another article about how do officials think about the costs of expropriation. So what do officials see as the cost of de facto nationalisation of COVID testing? The proposed change will not have any direct impacts. Orders made under the new provision may impose obligations or restrictions on testing laboratories to ensure quality of testing, integration of test results with the public testing repository, and regulation of testing consumables. It is important to note that an order to requisition supplies or redirect capacity to the public health response would only be made if there was significant COVID-19 resurgence where there is insufficient testing capacity in the public system. Well, considering we don't have any form of saliva testing going on by the government because it's being done privately by Rayco, I would say that it's very likely that there will be a requisition for this. Here's what the regulatory impact statement says about costs. There may be modest costs to the Crown in administering any regulatory regime, should this be required. There may also be administrative and other costs for public-private laboratories, depending on what is proposed. These costs would be accessed at the time any order is made. The RES essentially repeats that last sentence when it says a full cost assessment will be undertaken should a COVID-19 public health order be proposed under the new provisions. Right. Set aside for the fact that the officials who cannot secure MIQ or order vaccines on time officially cannot deliver on any of those benefits, right? Do you trust these officials? The MIQ system in New Zealand is an absolute trash fire. It should be burnt up and exploded. It's absolute rubbish the way that the MIQ system is currently working. Kiwis are desperately trying to get back and they can't. Vaccine rollout has been extremely slow because we couldn't get off our asses, well, not us, the officials couldn't get off their asses properly to get vaccines ordered in the amount of time that they can. Focus on costs. Officials seems to be operating with a cost model that threatening to take a company's IP is costless and costs crystallize only when property is actually taken. If you make these kind of comments about a company, their stock price has their stock price has an effect on what you're saying, right? Whatever you say affects the stock price. It can have huge ramifications for a company. It's just ridiculous. The cost of all the investment so also the cost is all the investment in innovation that would not happen in the future as well. So basically, if they get taken over, then any of the innovation that happens afterwards doesn't belong to the company anymore, right? So if this comes to pass, why would a company bother investing in anything to do with COVID-19 if they know the government could expropriate it at some whatever cost they decide? What's the point in expending all your money to that, right? It's going to reduce the amount of research that's going into COVID-19 by private companies who actually produce most of the stuff that we actually use. So universities and so on produce the research for maybe creating a test, but it's these private companies which then take that and produce something real that can be used in real life. So I think this is a very, very real worry, the way the government is going. It really does introduce legislation which is introducing socialism type stuff. And as we know, our leader Jacinda Ardern used to be the youth leader of a socialist activist group. So it's no surprise that her socialism tendencies are starting to come through. Anyway, what do you think? Do you find this worrying? That a government can just expropriate with this legislation, if it passes, it hasn't passed yet, that they could just expropriate a private company to do what the government should be paying other people to actually do, considering we're borrowing so much money and throwing it around all over the place. Let me know what you think in the comment section. I would love to see your comments. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't like the video, you can give it a thumbs down. That's perfectly fine by me. And if you like my content, then please subscribe. It just helps my videos get noticed by the YouTube algorithm, and hopefully more people will find it. Anyway, that's it for this video. I will catch you in the next one, hopefully.